In 1931, her husband left her for the mill stenographer, but the ledger he left in his desk told the real story. The new suitcase told her before Ned did. It stood in the front hall of the house on Chestnut Street on a Saturday morning in October of 1931, beside his old Gladstone bag, the scuffed brown one that had traveled with him to every mill convention from Springfield to Portland for 20 years. The new one was pigskin, pale as a biscuit, with brass corners that caught the light from the hall window. A man does not buy a new suitcase for nothing. Ruth Halloway understood that the way she understood most things, quickly, quietly, and without being told a word. Ned came down the stairs with his overcoat folded over his arm and stopped at the sight of her sitting on the hall bench. He smoothed his collar, the way he always did before unpleasant business, and looked at a point somewhere above her head. He said that they needed to talk. Ruth folded her hands in her lap and waited. 22 years of marriage had taught her that much. He said there was someone else, a girl from the mill office, a stenographer, 26 years old. He said her name as though it cost him something. Doris. He had taken a sales position in Hartford with a company that handled woolen goods south of the state line, and he was living there now, and he wanted her to hear it from him and not from the town. He said all of this to the hat rack. Ruth asked when. He seemed relieved by the plainness of the question. The train left at 11:40, he said. He had hoped. He didn't finish what he had hoped. She watched him take up the bags, the old one in his left hand, the new one in his right. At the door, he turned and told her he was sorry, that he truly was. She nodded. The door closed with its familiar click, and the house went still around her. She sat on the bench for the better part of an hour. Then she stood, went to the kitchen, and filled the enamel coffee pot at the sink. The water drummed against the tin, an ordinary sound she had heard 10,000 times, and now it filled every room of the house. The house was a good one. 6 rooms, a porch that caught the morning sun, a pear tree by the fence that Ned had planted the year they moved in. They had bought it in 1919, and Ruth had made every payment her business. She could still tell you the date the mortgage was retired, the 14th of May, 1928. And how she had felt more that afternoon than on any wedding anniversary she could remember. The papers were in a tin box at the Hadley Falls Savings Bank, in an envelope with Ned's handwriting on it. But the deed itself was in 2 names, his and hers together. She had insisted on that in 1919, quietly, the way she insisted on things then, once, and without raising her voice. It was the business school in her. She had never once been sorry about it until now, and now she was not sorry either. She was something else. She was a woman reading her own handwriting on a door that was half hers. She poured the water over the coffee and stood watching the grounds swirl and settle, and thought that she should telephone her sister in Chicopee. Then she thought better of it. Margaret would say she had always known. Ruth did not need anyone's always known this morning. She needed the quiet, and the quiet, at least, was hers. On Sunday, she began to gather the things he had not taken. It surprised her how much a man could leave behind when he had decided to travel light into a new life. Collars gone yellow at the fold, a set of cufflinks he had called unlucky, catalogs from mill suppliers, an almanac from 1927, a shaving brush with the bristles gone soft. She put the photographs from the parlor shelf into a paper sack, all but one, a snapshot of herself alone on the porch steps, taken the summer the pear tree first bore fruit. Ned had held the camera, but only she was in the picture. She slipped it into her apron pocket and tied the sack closed. Then she opened the bottom drawer of his desk. Under a stack of blank order forms and a rubber band of old receipt stubs, she found the ledger. She knew it before her hand touched it. Green leather gone gray at the corners, the boards soft from years of handling, and on the spine, pressed in gold that had mostly worn away, 2 letters. R.C. Ruth Halloway. She carried it to the kitchen table and sat down with it the way you sit down with a person you have not seen in a very long time. She had bought it in the spring of 1908, in the stationery shop on Main Street, with her 3rd pay envelope from Wren's Dry Goods. She was 21 years old, fresh out of the Hadley Falls Business School, where she had finished at the top of her class in bookkeeping and the Burroughs machine. And old Mr. Wren had taken her on as assistant bookkeeper over the objections of his son, who believed a shop was no place for a girl with a pencil. The ledger cost her nearly a week's wages. It was the first thing she had ever bought that belonged entirely to her, and she had kept the store's sample accounts in it, her own neat columns, her own small, precise hand, calico and kerosene and flour balanced to the penny. In 1909, she married Ned Halloway, a rising office man at the Hadley Woolen Company, and Ned had explained, kindly and without room for argument, that a wife working for wages reflected poorly on a husband. That was how things stood in Hadley Falls, and she had not fought it, because she was 23 and in love, and the whole town stood on Ned's side of the question without ever being asked. The ledger had come to the marriage with her, in a crate with her linens and her mother's mirror. Ned had found it one afternoon and admired the binding. He said it was too fine a book to sit in a crate, and he set it in the drawer of his desk, to keep the household accounts straight, he said. Except that Ned never kept the household accounts. Ruth kept them, in her head, in a dime store notebook, in the margins of the church circular. He had liked the look of the ledger on his desk, that was all. For 22 years it had lain in his drawer, and she had told herself she would take it back later, when there was a reason. Later had become a habit, the way it does. She opened the cover. The first pages were her young woman's handwriting, the entries of 1908, straight-backed and sure of themselves. Received, 40 yards gingham, 11 cents. Paid, freight to Springfield. Balance carried forward. Then the pages went blank. Hundreds of blank pages, ruled in red and blue, waiting 22 years for her to come back. Ruth sat at the kitchen table until the light changed, running her thumb along the worn spine, and something in her chest that had been tight since Saturday loosened. Not with grief, but with a strange, steady anger that felt almost like waking up. On Monday morning, she put on her good grey coat and walked to the Hadley Falls Savings Bank. The bank was marble-floored and cold, built in the confident years before the war, and Mr. Eyre, the head teller, knew her by sight. She asked, in a voice she kept level, for the balance of the household account. He consulted his book, and his face did something she had seen on faces at funerals. He was sorry to tell her, he said, that the account stood at $61 and change. There had been a withdrawal 3 weeks past. A large one. He did not say the amount loudly, and she was grateful for that, standing in her good coat in the middle of the marble floor with 2 women from the church circle waiting behind her. She walked home the long way, past the mill. The Hadley Woolen Company had been running short time since the spring of 1930, 4 days a week, then 3, and the notice board at the gate was crowded with men who read the posted hours the way men read obituaries. The whistle still blew at noon, out of habit more than need. Ruth looked at the windows of the mill office on the 2nd floor, where for all those years Ned had sat at his roll-top desk, with his collar smoothed and his reputation polished, and where a 26-year-old stenographer had typed his letters, and she wondered how long a thing could grow in the dark under your own roof. That night, after a supper she barely tasted, she took the ledger from the drawer, wiped its cover with a damp cloth, and sat down at the kitchen table with a freshly sharpened pencil. She opened it past the young girl's pages from 1908 to the first blank leaf, and at the top of it,
In a hand that was rounder now, but no less exact, she wrote, October 12th, 1931. House accounts of Ruth Halloway. Cash on hand, $14.22. She looked at the line for a moment.
Then, beneath it, because it was true, and because it mattered that someone write down what was true, she added, Ode to no one. There was a sign in the window of Bartlett and Foss, the wholesale grocery house down on Canal Street, that she had passed 4 times in the last 2 weeks on her way to the butcher's. It said, Bookkeeper wanted. Apply within. Each time she had walked past it, she had told herself she was a married woman, that Ned would not have it, that a wife's wages reflected on a husband. Tomorrow she would walk down to Canal Street again. She was not a married woman anymore, not in any way that paid for coal. Bartlett and Foss stood on Canal Street, where the old canal basin met the rail spur, a long brick building with Bartlett and Foss, wholesale grocers, painted in white letters across the side, faded to the color of old bone. The Bartlett had been dead for 15 years, and the Foss was Amos Foss, 64 years old, who came in every morning at 7 and unlocked the warehouse himself because he had never learned to trust a key in another man's hand. Ruth climbed the wooden stair to the office at 8 o'clock on Tuesday morning, her good coat brushed, her hair pinned, her hands steady. She had not slept much. She had decided, somewhere around 3 in the morning, that there was no dignity in waiting to be rescued, and no shame at all in arithmetic. The office was a high-ceilinged room over the warehouse floor, with tall windows that rattled when the freight cars coupled on the spur. It smelled of coffee beans and kerosene and dust. There were 4 desks. At one of them sat a young woman with red hair and a typewriter. At another, a gray man with green eye shades who did not look up. A pot-bellied stove ticked in the corner. Amos Foss came out of his glass-partitioned office and looked at her the way a man looks at a weather change. She told him her name and said she had come about the bookkeeper's position. He said he was sorry, but the position required experience, considerable experience, and he did not believe she had it. He said it not cruelly, but the way you close a door, completely, and with the expectation that the matter is finished. Ruth said that she had kept books for Wren's Dry Goods before her marriage, that she had finished first in her class at the business school, and that she had kept a household on a mill office salary through the worst years anybody could remember, with the taxes paid and the mortgage retired, and that if he would show her his books, she would show him her experience. She heard her own voice as she said it, level, unhurried, the voice of a woman counting out change. Foss looked at her for a long moment. Then he reached into a drawer of the nearest desk and pulled out a pasteboard box and set it on the counter with a soft thump. Inside was a tangle of invoices, delivery tickets, and credit slips, some of them months old, a few of them still smelling of the produce seller. His clerk of 20 years had gone to pieces in the summer, he said, and the man who had replaced him had lasted 9 weeks. This was what 9 weeks looked like. If she could make sense of it, if she could match what was owed against what was paid, and tell him what the box actually contained, she could come back at 7 in the morning, and they would talk about wages. He meant it as a dismissal. Ruth heard it as a door opening. She sat down at the counter without asking leave, unpinned her hat, and went to work. The red-haired girl bought her a cup of coffee without being asked, and set it down with a small, conspiratorial nod. The grey man in the eye shades watched over the top of his newspaper. Out on the warehouse floor, a wagon came in for a load of flour, and the floorboards carried the rumble up through the soles of her shoes. The box was not difficult. It was only neglected. That was the first thing her old teacher at the business school had drummed into her. There is no such thing as tangled figures, only tangled habits. She sorted the slips by house, then by date, then matched delivery tickets against invoices and credit slips against returns.
and by 10:30, she had the whole of it in 4 stacks, with a sheet of her own penciled notes on top, showing what Bartlett and Foss was owed, what it owed, and where 2 deliveries had been billed twice. She put on her hat and laid the sheet where Foss could not miss it, and went home through the cold, bright morning, with her heart going like a girl's. At 7 the next morning, Foss met her at the office door, with his coat already on his arm, ready to go down to the warehouse. He had read her notes. He had checked them against the safe. He did not say, "Well done." He said the wage was $14 a week, Saturdays half a day, and she would answer to him and to no one else. Ruth said that was agreeable. He looked at her again with that weather-change look and added, as though it were a complaint, that the last man had wanted 18 and couldn't find his own desk. That was how, on the 21st of October, 1931, 10 days after her husband walked out of the house with a pigskin suitcase, Ruth Halloway went back to work. She walked home that first Saturday with her pay envelope in her handbag, $14, in bills that were soft from other hands. She had forgotten the particular weight of it, the way money you have earned yourself sits differently in the palm than money you have been given for the housekeeping. At the kitchen table, she opened the green ledger to her page and wrote, under the line that said "Owed to no one," October 24th, 1931, wages, 1 week, Bartlett and Foss, $14. Then she sat looking at the 2 lines, the claim and the proof of it, until the kettle boiled. Lena Marsh heard the news in her beauty parlor on Mechanic Street and closed the shop for half an hour, which for Lena was the equivalent of a public celebration. She came up the porch steps with a permanent wave cape still around her shoulders and a tin of butter cookies under her arm, and she sat at Ruth's kitchen table and said what nobody else in Hadley Falls was going to say out loud, that any man who would walk out on Ruth Halloway was a man the town had overestimated for 20 years, and good riddance. And would there be cookies enough for her too, or did she have to beg? Lena had been divorced since 1924, which in Hadley Falls made her a kind of landmark, the way the burnt hotel was a landmark. People gave directions by her. She had taken the settlement, such as it was, and opened the beauty parlor. And she kept a framed photograph of Calvin Coolidge behind the cash register, partly out of conviction, and partly because it annoyed certain of her customers, whom she could afford to annoy, because she was the only permanent wave between Hadley Falls and Holyoke. She was the first person who did not say she was sorry about Ned. She said she had always thought his collars were too tight for his conscience. And Ruth laughed for the first time in 2 weeks and had to put down her cup. It was Lena who raised the question Ruth had been circling. $14 a week was a living for one careful woman, but it was not a margin. And a house with a pear tree and a porch and a coal furnace, 8 margins. Lena knew a woman, a widow from the Polish end of town, a quiet woman, clean as a whistle, who took in laundry and had a little girl, and had lost her room over the feed store when the feed store cut its building in half. Her name was Stella Kowalski. Her husband had been killed 3 years before in a shaft accident at the Hadley Woolen Dye House, which the mill had called an act of God, and everyone else called a rotten hoist. She had a little money from the funeral fund, long since spent, and hands that could get a collar clean when nobody else's could. If Ruth had the back bedroom to spare, Stella Kowalski had $5 a week and no trouble in her. Ruth sat with that for a day. The house had been Ned's house, then his and hers, then hers alone for 11 days, and she had discovered she liked the silence more than she liked being lonely in company. But she had run the figures in her head before Lena finished talking. That was the thing about Ruth. The figures ran themselves. And $5 a week was the coal bill, and the taxes and the insurance on the roof, and the difference between getting by and getting ahead. On the 1st of November, Stella Kowalski came up the walk with her daughter beside her, and all their worldly goods in 2 valises and a bedsheet bundle. Stella was 38, small and straight,
with a face that had decided some time ago not to ask anything of anybody. The little girl was 10, solemn as a judge, with dark braids and a school satchel worn white at the corners, and she stood in the front hall looking at the staircase as though she had never been in a house with stairs. Her name was Irma.
Ruth showed them the back bedroom and the little room off it that had been meant once for a nursery, and had held a sewing machine and 30 years of good intentions instead. Stella looked at the 2 rooms and at the clean sheets Ruth had put on the beds, and she said in her careful, accented English that she did laundry for several ladies in town and would do the households with it as part of the arrangement, if that was agreeable. Ruth said laundry was not part of the arrangement, but supper was, if Stella was willing to eat at a kitchen table with people. Irma looked up at her mother for permission first. Ruth noticed that, the way the girl checked every step against her mother's face, and then at Ruth, and said, "Thank you, Mrs. Halloway," with a gravity that made Ruth want to kneel down and tell her the world was not as serious a place as all that. She did not. She was learning, slowly, what you could give children and what they had to find out alone. The letter from her sister came that same week. Margaret wrote from Chicopee in a hand that slanted like rain, and the letter was everything Ruth had not wanted on the first morning. She had always known. She had never trusted him. A man who smoothed his collar before he spoke was a man rehearsing. And Ruth must come and stay with her. There was the spare room. Frank wouldn't mind. No woman should be alone at such a time. Ruth read it, standing at the kitchen window, with the November light going grey over the pear tree. And then she folded it small and put it in the stove. She wrote back 4 lines. She was well. She had taken a position at Bartlett and Foss. She had a nice widow and her little girl in the back bedroom. She would come at Christmas if the trains ran.
She did not say, "You always knew, and I never asked." There was no profit in it. That was another thing the business school had taught her, though not in so many words. Some entries you do not post, because posting them only makes the debt permanent. Winter came down on the valley the way it always did, all at once, and then forever. Ruth walked to Canal Street in the dark and home in the dark, and the days between were figures. She learned the house accounts of 47 customers, the rhythm of the warehouse, the way the coffee importers' invoices always arrived a week after the goods, the names of the drivers and which of them could be trusted with an unlocked crate. She rebuilt the books from the summer's wreckage and then kept rebuilding backward, because the wreckage went further back than summer, further than anyone had wanted to look. It was the credit desk that troubled her. The gray man in the eye shades was Josiah Pruitt, who had kept the credit accounts of Bartlett and Foss for 30 years and was treated by everyone, including Foss, as a fixture. The kind of man you do not question because he has never been questioned. Ruth did not question him either that winter. She only noticed. She noticed that the bad debt write-offs had a shape to them, small and regular, and always in accounts that paid in cash. And she noticed that the shape had begun a long time ago, in the years when the old bookkeeper had been failing and nobody was checking anyone's work but their own. She wrote nothing down and said nothing. She was the new woman, and the new woman does not accuse a fixture in her first winter. But she began, in the green ledger at home, on a page headed only with a date and a question mark, to keep a private column of her own. At night the house was warm and full of small sounds that were not Ned. Stella ironing in the kitchen, the radio low, Irma doing her lessons at the end of the table with her tongue in the corner of her mouth. Ruth would sit with the household books, and sometimes, when the lessons were arithmetic, Irma would drift down the table to watch. The girl had a head for it. Ruth saw it the way you see weather coming, the quick eye, the pleasure in a column that footed true. She began to let Irma check her grocery sums, and then to bring home the clean scrap from the office for the girl to practice columns on.
and she told herself it was only kindness, though some part of her, a part that had been asleep for 22 years, knew it was also something else. It was a torch looking for a hand. The Hadley Woolen Company closed its gates for good in June of 1932. It did not happen with a crash.
It happened the way mills died in those years. The 4-day week had become the 3-day week. The 3-day week had become the indefinite layoff. And the indefinite layoff had become, one grey morning, a notice nailed to the gate and a watchman where the shift used to be. Ruth walked past on her way to Canal Street and saw the men standing in front of the notice in their good caps, reading it over and over, as though the words might change under their eyes. She knew most of their wives. She had sat with them in the church circle and traded recipes and compared the price of coal. And now she walked past with her handbag over her arm and her job under it. And she felt the particular guilt of the spared. The guilt of having a pay envelope when other women's envelopes had stopped coming. Some of those wives would not look at her now. Ruth noticed that too, and understood it. She had become something the town did not have a comfortable word for. A woman with a desk. A deserted wife was pitiable, and a widow was respectable. But a woman of 46 who walked to work every morning with her head up was a question nobody wanted to answer. At the church circle that winter, they offered her a basket of cast-off clothing for, as Mrs. Bemis put it, the poor dear's difficult situation. And Ruth thanked her with great steadiness and said that her situation included a salary and 2 paying lodgers, but that the Kowalski girls' school coat was getting small, and if the basket held anything in a girl's 12, she would be glad to pay a fair price for it. The circle did not know what to do with that. Mrs. Bemis's basket stayed under the table, and Ruth poured coffee for the room and did not spill a drop. That was the winter the bank failed to be a place you could trust. In the first days of March 1933, the new president closed every bank in the country, and Hadley Falls Savings shut its marble doors with the rest. Ruth had $61 in there still. She had never moved it, out of a stubbornness she could not have explained, as though moving it would have meant Ned had frightened her, and she had the rest of her small savings in a cocoa tin on the pantry shelf. Because a woman who had once stood at a teller's window and heard bad news kept her own counsel after that. The cocoa tin held $190 by that March, and it was the only bank in Hadley Falls that opened on Monday morning. Foss paid wages in cash that week and the week after from the safe, counting the bills out with his own hands, and Ruth noted each payment in the office cash book and again in the green ledger at home, because the world had gone wobbly and arithmetic had not. The bank reopened in time, chastened, with new federal insurance on the deposits, and Ruth put some of the cocoa tin back through the marble doors and left some of it where it was. A woman who has been left once keeps a tin on the shelf. That is not fear. That is bookkeeping. It was that spring, the spring of 1933, when the mill gate had been nailed shut almost a year, and men were beginning to disappear west to the construction camps and the government work, that Foss hired a new inventory clerk. And the new inventory clerk turned out to be a man Ruth knew by sight from the mill. His name was Eddie Tillman. He had been the cost accountant at Hadley Woolen for 11 years, which meant he had worked 1 floor down from Ned and 1 floor up from the looms. And he had been let go in the first layoff, the one that took the men the company could most afford to lose, which was always, in those years, the men the company could least afford to lose. He was a thin, precise man of 50, with a ruined hip from a boyhood accident, and an unsurprised face. And the first morning he saw Ruth at the counter of the Bartlett and Foss office, he stopped with his hat in his hands, and she watched him decide what to say to the wife of Ned Halloway. And what he finally said
was that he had heard she kept the finest household books in the county, and he was glad the firm had had the sense to hire her.
It was a kind thing to say, and a strange one, because Ruth had never told a soul at the mill about her household books. She thanked him, and thought no more about it that day, but it lodged in her, the way a small stone lodges in a shoe, and it stayed there for years, waiting for its season. The house on Chestnut Street settled into its new shape. Stella's laundry trade grew by word of mouth. The mill owners' wives, who had once sent their linen to Holyoke, now sent it to the Polish widow on Chestnut Street, because hard times had a way of discovering quality, and she paid her $5 every Saturday morning in bills ironed flat, which Ruth entered in the ledger as though it were a transaction between great houses, because it was.
Irma grew an inch every season, and 2 inches in her confidence, and by the time she was 12, she was doing Ruth's grocery columns for practice and finding the deliberate errors Ruth planted for her faster than Ruth could plant them. On Sunday afternoons in the winter, Ruth taught her double-entry bookkeeping at the kitchen table, with the radio playing low and Stella mending by the stove, and it was the nearest thing to peace that Ruth had known in years. She did not call it happiness. She had become superstitious about that word. But there were evenings when she looked down the lamp-lit table at the girl's bent, dark head and thought that the room off the back bedroom had waited 30 years for a nursery and had gotten a counting room instead, and that the difference was not a loss.
She heard about Ned the way you hear weather from another county, in letters from Margaret, in the talk of traveling salesmen at the warehouse, in the small change of a town where everyone had once known everyone. The sales position in Hartford had not lasted. The woolen jobbing company had let him go before the first year was out. Poor times, they said. Retrenchment. And he had taken a position with the Notions House in Springfield, and then another, shorter one. And the letters and the talk had a shape to them that Ruth recognized without being able to name it yet. He had married the Peavy girl, she heard, in the spring of 1933, quietly in Hartford. Margaret's letter about it was full of italics. Ruth read it standing at the kitchen window again, and found to her own surprise that what she felt was not pain, but a kind of distant professional curiosity, the way she might have looked at a column of figures that did not foot. Something was wrong there, and she did not yet have the documents to say what. The documents began to arrive, in their own way, in the autumn of 1934. It started with the credit desk. Ruth's private column in the Green Ledger had grown for 2 years, patient as moss. Small write-offs, cash accounts, Josiah Pruitt's elegant old-fashioned hand declaring bad debts on houses that Ruth happened to know, from the warehouse talk, had paid their bills in full and in cash. She checked her suspicion the way she checked everything, 3 times, from 3 directions, with dates. Then she did the hardest thing she had done since the morning of the pigskin suitcase, which was to lay it in front of Amos Foss without any certainty of what he would do with it. Foss read her pages in his glass office for a long time. He was not a man who enjoyed believing ill of anyone, and Pruitt had been with the firm since before the Spanish War. But Foss had not kept a wholesale house alive through a panic and a depression by preferring comfort to arithmetic. The amounts were small. That was the cleverness of it. $30 here, $50 there, the skim of a careful man. But over the years they made a river, and the river ran to Pruitt. There was no scene. Foss was too old and too proud for scenes, and perhaps too ashamed of his own 30 years of not looking. Josiah Pruitt retired at the end of October 1934 with a gold-handled letter opener and a statement in the county paper about his long and faithful service. And only 3 people in Hadley Falls ever knew why the retirement party was so small. Ruth was not proud of it, but she was not sorry either. The books were the books. Foss raised her to $18 a week and moved her to the credit desk.
And then, in the spring of 1935, when the red-haired girl married a railroad man and moved to Albany, and Ruth had been doing her work and her own for 6 months without being asked, he put her in charge of the whole office. He did it in his usual way, which was to complain that she might as well have the title since she had the work, and that he supposed he would have to pay her $26 now, which was robbery, and she could start Monday.
Miss Flaherty's replacement, a bright, frightened girl from the high school's commercial course, 19 years old, was told to apply to Mrs. Halloway, and when the girl asked, in a whisper, whether Mrs. Halloway was strict, Foss was heard to say, out loud, in front of the whole warehouse, that strict was not the word. The word was exact, and the girl would do well to learn the difference, as it was the difference between a job and an education. Ruth was 50 years old that year. She signed her first order as office manager on a Tuesday, and that night she wrote it in the green ledger, in the same columnar hand as the wages and the coal. May 6, 1935. Put in charge of the office, Bartlett and Foss.
Then she sat for a while with her pencil in her hand, and finally, because it was true, and it mattered that someone write down what was true, she added, "Did not tell anyone it was the best day of my life. Am telling the book." The letter from Ned came in November of 1934, before the promotion, when the trees were bare and the first coal of the winter had just been delivered. She knew the handwriting on the envelope the way you know a footstep on the stair. He wrote from Springfield, on paper with a business letterhead she did not recognize, some Notions house, a name that sounded like 2 other names. The letter was 3 pages, and it took him 2 of them to arrive at his business. He hoped she was well. He had heard she had taken a position, and he was glad. He had always said she had a good head. Times were hard for everyone. His own affairs were in a transitional state. And then, in the 3rd paragraph of the 3rd page, the point. He had been thinking about the house on Chestnut Street. Property was a burden to a woman alone. There were buyers in better times coming back now, and if the place were sold, the proceeds, properly divided, would set each of them on a more comfortable footing. He was sure she would see the sense of it. She had always been a sensible woman. Ruth read the letter at the kitchen table, with Stella's iron thumping softly on the board in the corner and Irma's pencil scratching at her sums. Then she got up, went to the tin box she had brought home from the bank the year after the mortgage was retired, and took out the deed. 2 names. She had insisted in 1919, once, quietly, the business school in her sitting up straight at the lawyer's desk, and the lawyer had raised his eyebrows and written it down.
She had wondered for 22 years whether that had been forward of her. She stood in her own parlor with the deed in her hand, and was not wondering any more. Her answer was 4 lines, like her letter to Margaret had been. The house was not for sale. The taxes were paid, the roof was sound, and the burden sat lightly. She wished him well. She signed it, Ruth Halloway, which she had begun to do at the office, and saw no reason not to do everywhere. She did not say, "I know what the withdrawal was for, and I know what a pigskin suitcase costs, and I have added it up, Ned, to the penny. Some entries you do not post." But she entered the letter itself in the green ledger, on the page of dates that had become her private record. November 19th, 1934. Letter from N. Re. House. Answered. House not for sale. And underneath, before she could stop herself, in the small, exact hand, "He needs money. Note that he wrote to me for it." It was Eddie Tillman who finally gave her the documents for the thing she had been feeling since the letters from Hartford began. And he did it without meaning to, on a wet Thursday in the spring of 1936, over the annual inventory. They were working late, the 2 of them, matching the warehouse tallies against the stock cards, with the rain on the tall windows and the stove going. The work went fast with Tillman. He had the same disease she had,
the inability to leave a column unfooted. Somewhere in the second hour, over the canned goods, they got to talking about the mill. Everyone in Hadley Falls over 40 talked about the mill the way old soldiers talk about a regiment. And Tillman said, idly, not looking up from his tally, that whatever else anyone said about Ned Halloway, the man's sales journals had been the cleanest books in the county, bar none. He said he had audited them himself 3 years running when the bank required it, and he had never found so much as a misplaced decimal. Marvelous work. He used to tell the other clerks that Halloway had a machine between his ears. Ruth stood very still with a stock card in her hand. Tillman went on, oblivious, turning a page. It had been the joke of the office, he said, because the strangest thing was, the man couldn't add a column of figures in front of you to save his life.
Put him at a desk with the door shut, and out came books like printed copperplate. All the reconciliations done, every consignment accounted for, always overnight, always at home. The general manager used to say Halloway did his best thinking at his own fireside. Tillman chuckled, and then he looked up and saw Ruth's face, and the chuckle died, and she watched him, this precise, unsurprised man, put it together in real time. The household books he had somehow heard were the finest in the county, the fireside, the overnight columns, the machine between the ears that could not add in company. He did not say anything. To his everlasting credit, in Ruth's private accounting, he did not say anything. He turned back to the canned goods and said that the tally of tomatoes was off by 2 cases, and they found the 2 cases, and they finished the inventory.
But the knowledge stood between them now, solid as the stove. And from that night on, when Eddie Tillman said good evening to her, he said it the way you say good evening to someone whose true rank you have finally learned. Ruth walked home through the rain without feeling it. In her room, she took down the crate that had followed her through every rearrangement of the house, and from under the linens and her mother's mirror, she brought out the dime store notebooks, a dozen of them, soft-backed, swollen with years. She opened them on the bed under the lamp, her own handwriting, 1919 to 1931. Not household accounts, those had always been in her head. These were mill figures, sales summaries recopied and corrected, consignment reconciliations, cost allocations worked and reworked in pencil in her small, exact hand, dated, hundreds of pages of them.
She remembered every one of those evenings now with perfect clarity. Ned spreading the papers on the dining table after supper with a sigh about the incompetence of the shipping clerks, and Ruth clearing the plates and sitting down with her cocoa, just to look, just to help. Just because a column that would not foot was a thing she could not leave alone, any more than Tillman could. She had thought of it as mending. You mended what was torn in your own house. He had carried it to the mill in the morning, and it had come out of his briefcase as his, and it had never once occurred to her, not once in 22 years. But when the county said Ned Halloway kept the finest books in western Massachusetts, they were talking about her hands. She sat on the bed until the lamp had burned low, and Stella had gone up and the house was quiet. And she did not cry. What she felt was stranger than grief, and cleaner than anger. It was recognition. She had spent 4 years building a self she thought she had lost. And all along the self had never been lost. It had been working nights at her own dining table, uncredited, balancing another man's reputation to the penny and entering it forever under his name. She took out the green ledger. She turned past the wages and the coal and the taxes to the page of dates, and she wrote, April 30th, 1936. Inventory with E.T. Learned tonight what the county believed it was praising all those years. Cannot be angry at the town. The town saw the books. It only saw the wrong name on them. Then she closed the cover and sat holding the book in both hands
and the gold letters on the spine, R.C., caught the lamplight, worn almost to nothing and still legible, like most true things. The last document arrived in September of that year, and it was the one she would have sworn under oath she would never receive. It was a letter from Ned, but not like the others. The letterhead was a boarding house in Springfield. The hand was the same and not the same. The confident slant had gone out of it. He was in difficulty, he wrote. There was a tangle in the accounts of the house he worked for, a serious tangle. Inventories that would not reconcile, and the owners were losing patience. He did not know what to do. He wondered. He knew it was a great deal to ask. He knew he had no right to ask it. Whether she might look the figures over, as a favor, for old time's sake. She had always had such a head for that kind of thing. He could pay a little. Not what it was worth, but something. Ruth read it twice at the kitchen table. Irma, 14 now, watched her from the other end and did not speak. And Ruth was aware, with the peculiar clarity of that whole year, that there was a witness to this moment, and that it mattered what the witness saw. She folded the letter and put it in the stove, and then, because she was who she was, and the girl was watching, and the truth was the only inheritance she had to give, she said what it was. She said that the letter was from a man she had once been married to, asking her to do for money, in secret, the work she had done for love, in secret, for 22 years. And that the answer was no, not because of what he had done to her, but because of what she had finally done for herself. She had put her own name on her own work. And work with your name on it is not for sale to people who spent decades signing theirs. Irma nodded slowly, the way she nodded when a column footed true. She was too young to understand all of it. Ruth watched her understand the part that mattered, and filed the moment in her heart under the heading of things that balance. In the winter of 1938, the town began, cautiously, to breathe again. Not prosper. Nobody used that word in Hadley Falls in 1938, because 1937 had come down on the valley like a second illness after the first. But breathe. The WPA sewing room in the basement of the Methodist Church had 60 women at the machines and a waiting list. A state road crew had straightened the worst curve on the Holyoke Road. The mill buildings stood empty, except for the dye house, which a rag company had taken for storage. But 2 small shops had opened on Main Street where the Wren's building used to be, and on Saturdays the farmers came in again, not spending much, but spending. Ruth was 51 years old, and the office of Bartlett and Foss ran to her hand the way the looms had once run to the mills. Payroll for 22, 47 house accounts now grown to 61, the railroad claims, the insurance, the taxes, the whole arithmetic of keeping food moving into a valley that could not grow enough of its own. She signed the hiring letters herself now. Foss was 67 and had begun to stay home on the rawest days, and on those days the key to the warehouse was in Ruth's handbag, and no one in the building thought that strange anymore. It was on a Tuesday in March of 1938, a sleety morning, that the girl from the commercial course, Agnes, no longer frightened, 23 now and quick, laid the morning's mail and a thin folder on Ruth's desk and said there was an applicant for the stenographer's position, the one they had been advertising since February, and that the references were in the folder and the woman was waiting downstairs. Ruth opened the folder. She read the name at the top of the application, and the room went very quiet. The way the house had gone quiet once, on a Saturday morning with 2 suitcases in the hall. Doris P.V. Halloway, age 33. Widowed, the application said, and Ruth noted, with the part of her mind that never stopped keeping books, the small factual error. Not widowed, divorced. Hartford, 1935. She had heard as much from Margaret. Experience. Stenographer, the Hadley Woolen Company, 1929 to 1931. Stenographer and sales correspondent, Hartford, 1931 to 1935. Clerk, dry goods, Springfield, 1936 to 1937. Present address, Maple Street, Hadley Falls. Her mother's house, Ruth knew without being told. The girl, the woman, had come home the way they all came home in those years, when the money ran out, to the house that could not refuse them. 7 years, Ruth thought. 7 years since the pigskin suitcase. She looked at the handwriting on the application. Round, schoolgirl hand. Not a bad hand, neat enough for a stenographer. And she waited to feel something arrive. Triumph, or pain, or the sweet, cold juice of revenge. What arrived instead was memory, and not of Ned. It was the memory of herself at 45, in her good coat, climbing the wooden stair to this very office with $14.22 between herself and the void, asking a man behind a counter to show her his books so she could show him her experience. A woman alone with a town watching. That was the whole of what Doris P.V. Halloway was now. Ruth knew the shape of that fear better than anyone alive. She was not going to pretend it was simple. It was not simple. She sat with the folder open for 10 full minutes, and what she weighed was not whether Doris deserved the work. She had long since stopped keeping moral ledgers for other people. Her own was work enough. But whether she, Ruth, could be fair. Whether the name on the folder would bend her pencil. Because unfairness in either direction would be the same failure. It would mean the woman downstairs still had power over Ruth Halloway's hand. She signed the hiring letter in her small, exact hand. The same terms as the last girl. $18 a week, Saturday half-day, a month's trial like everyone. She signed it Ruth Calloway Halloway, office manager, and she told Agnes to show the new stenographer to her desk on Monday and see that she was taught the filing system like anyone else, neither better nor worse. The town, of course, had it by Wednesday. Lena brought it to the beauty parlor's door herself, leaning on the frame with her arms crossed, and asked whether Ruth had lost her mind or found her religion. And Ruth, who had known the question was coming since Tuesday, gave her the answer she had prepared, which was the true one. She said that she had spent 7 years becoming a woman whose work was her own, and that she was not going to let any person on God's earth, living, dead, or remarried, make her into someone who kept books by spite. The Peavy girl had needed a position. The position had needed a stenographer. The columns footed. That was all. Lena looked at her for a long moment, and then said that Ruth Calloway Halloway was the only woman in the Connecticut Valley who could make an act of war sound like a bank statement, and that if she ever wanted a free permanent, she had only to ask, which was the closest Lena Marsh ever came to saying she was proud of you. It was not all, of course, not quite. Doris turned out to be adequate, punctual, accurate enough, grateful in a subdued way that never once presumed. They spoke of work, when work required it, in the ordinary phrases, and if there was a strangeness for the whole office in those first weeks, it wore off the way strangeness does when the work is real and the payroll is on time. Once, in the autumn of that year, coming down the stair at closing time, Doris fell into step beside her and said, quickly and low, without looking at her, that she knew whose kindness the position was, and that she had not known, in 1931, that he had told her the marriage was over in everything but name, that she had believed him, that she had been 26 and believed a great many things a man said when he smoothed his collar. Ruth stopped on the stair and looked at her, really looked, perhaps for the first time, the softness gone out of the round face, the best coat 2 winters old, the careful, mended glove. She thought of the nights at the dining table, the columns, the fireside. She thought that this woman had also spent 4 years watching a man present a borrowed self as his own, and had paid for the discovery in the same currency. She did not say it was all right. It had not been all right, and she would not put a false entry in that book, not for anyone. What she said was that the past was not an account she collected on anymore, and that the filing system was alphabetical, and that Mrs. Peavy, for so she had gone back to being called, and Ruth had been the one, though Doris never knew it, who had written Peavy on the office roster without being asked, would do well to remember the invoices went under the creditor's name, not the town's. And Doris Peavy looked at her with her mended glove on the rail, and understood. The way you understand a door held open 1 inch. Not welcome, but not the wall either. It was enough. It was, Ruth found, the truth. And the truth was the only currency she dealt in now. The winter that came down before that March was the hardest the valley had seen since 1932, and Ruth never forgot it, because it was the winter she learned what it was to be the one other people depended on. The recession of 1937, the second sickness, the men at the warehouse called it, arrived in Hadley Falls like a freeze after a thaw. Orders that had been steady through 1936 thinned out in October, and by January the road crew was idled, and the sewing room had a waiting list again, and 2 of the shops on Main Street that had opened with such hope put cardboard in their windows. At Bartlett and Foss, the ledgers told the story before anyone said it aloud. The house accounts aged. The cash customers became charge customers. The charge customers became slow, and the slow ones became names you did not mention at the counter, out of kindness. Foss called her into the glass office on a Friday in January, with the sleet ticking on the windows, and put the question to her plainly, because they had long since stopped wasting words on each other. The firm could carry the full payroll for perhaps 4 months at the current rate of business. After that, men would have to be let go. He wanted her figures, which men, in what order, and how much would be saved. He said it the way a man says a thing he's been hoping not to say, and he did not look at her when he said it. Ruth took the payroll home that weekend. She sat at the kitchen table with the green ledger and the office books, and she knew every name on the list the way you know the names on your own street. Yannick, who drove the south route, and had 6 children and a wife who took in sewing. O'Connell, whose hip had never been right since the warehouse accident of '35. Young Dupree, who was courting and putting by for a house. The 2 Swede brothers, who sent half their wages to their mother in Worcester. 22 men and 3 women, and every one of them a household, and every household a column that had to foot. She did not bring Foss a list of names. She brought him a different page entirely. She had found it the way she found everything, in the figures themselves. The firm's own delivery costs were bloated. 3 routes crossed each other like tangled yarn. The trucks ran half empty to the hill towns on Tuesdays, when the stores there bought on Thursdays, and the coffee and tea contracts had not been rebid since before the panic. She showed him, line by line, in her small, exact hand, that the firm could save the wages of 4 men without letting go a single one, consolidate the Hilltown runs, rebid the 2 contracts, put the salesman on a draw against commission instead of straight salary, and, this was the line she had written last and checked most, because it was her own, reduce the office manager's salary by $4 a week until the orders came back. She was the highest paid person on the payroll who was not a Foss. It was the largest single number she could move without touching a man with 6 children. Foss read the page twice. He argued about her salary once, for form's sake, and she answered that she had a house that was paid for, and a tin in the pantry, and no one to support but the people she chose.
which was more than Yannick could say, and he grumbled and signed it. No one was let go that winter. The men never knew why, exactly. Foss was not a man for speeches, but Yannick's wife sent a jar of preserved plums to the office at Christmas the following year, addressed to the firm, and everyone understood who it was really for. And Ruth entered it in the green ledger under Things That Do Not Appear on a Balance Sheet, which was a page she had begun keeping without quite deciding to. It was that same hard winter that Stella's trade fell away. The mill owners' wives, who had discovered the Polish widows' collars when their own money got short, discovered in the second winter that they could do their own laundry after all, or make a daughter do it. And by February, Stella's basket was going out half full and coming back lighter than it left. Ruth watched her border grow quieter and straighter, which, in Stella, was the shape that worry took. And one evening in March, Stella came to the kitchen table and said, in her careful English, with her hands folded so the knuckles showed, that she could no longer pay the $5. She and Irma would go. There was a cousin in Chicopee who had a room, a narrow room, but a room, and she would not stay where she could not pay her way. And she asked Mrs. Halloway to understand that this was not ingratitude, but its opposite. Irma was 16 then. She stood behind her mother's chair with her face held very still, and Ruth saw what the stillness cost her. The business course in Holyoke was 2 years away and a world away, and the cousin's narrow room in Chicopee was the kind of room from which girls did not come back to courses in Holyoke. They went to the mill's leftover work or into service, and the columns of their lives were kept by other people from then on. Ruth told Stella to sit down. Then she did what she always did, which was to take out a pencil. The house did not cost $5 a week to carry, she said. It cost what it cost: taxes, coal, insurance, the roof. And those figures had names, and she knew them, and she put them on the table between them like cards. $3.20 was the truth of the back bedroom, the heat that rose to it, and the water. The rest of the $5 had been margin, and margin was a luxury, and this was not a luxurious year. So the arrangement would change. $3.20, and in the weeks when even that could not be met, the difference would be entered. Here, Ruth opened the green ledger to a fresh page and wrote at the top, in her small, exact hand, S.K. suspended, and carried at no interest against better times. Because that was what books were for, to hold a thing steady until it could stand. Stella looked at the page for a long moment. Then she said, and her voice was not quite level, that in her country there was a saying about bread and salt, that you did not forget the hands that gave them. And Ruth said that in her country there was a saying too, which was that a column had to foot, and this one footed, and that was the end of it. It was not the end of it. Stella stayed, and the page headed S.K. suspended filled slowly with small figures, and after the orders came back in '39, Stella paid every line of it off, bill by eye and bill, without being asked. And when the last entry was made, Ruth drew a double line under the column and wrote, "Paid in full," and under it, because it was true, it always was. The other fight of that winter was Irma's, though Irma never knew it was a fight. The girl finished at the high school in June of 1938, with the highest marks in the commercial course and a mathematics prize, $5 in gold-colored coin, and a certificate that Stella had framed at the 5 and dime and hung in the back bedroom, where the light from the hall could find it. The position in Holyoke was real, the business course, 2 years, and then the kind of desk that did not exist in Hadley Falls for a girl from the Polish end of town. The cost was $40 a term, plus car fare, plus books. Ruth had the figures before anyone asked her. She had had them for 2 years in a page of the green ledger headed I.K., with a small deposit entered against it every month
since the spring of 1936, the $4 a week of her own salary that had not gone to Janek's root or the coal man, but had been quietly put by, because a torch looking for a hand must also, in the end, put its money where its hope was. The principal of the high school was a decent man named Horn, who believed he was being kind. He asked Stella to the school office, not Ruth, Stella, and only Stella, which Ruth noted, and he told her with genuine warmth that Irma was a remarkable girl, and that he would be sorry to see her reach too high.
There was fine work for a neat girl in service, in the best houses in Holyoke, with a future in it, and the business colleges were full of girls who would be clerking for $5 a week in 3 years, and glad of it. And a mother would want to think carefully before spending money a family did not have on a course that led, so often, nowhere. He meant well. That was the worst of it, Ruth thought afterward, sitting with Stella at the kitchen table, while Stella's hands twisted her apron. He meant well. And the well-meaning were the ones who closed the most doors, because no one ever thought to lock a door against them. It was Ruth who went to Holyoke on the Saturday, because Stella could not get the day and because, though neither of them said it, a woman in a good grey coat with a checkbook was heard differently in a registrar's office than a laundrywoman with an accent.
Ruth paid the first term in full and asked for the receipt to be made out to Miss Irma Kowalski, student. And when the registrar asked her relation to the girl, Ruth said evenly that she was the girl's employer of arithmetic, which had been true since the grocery columns at the kitchen table, and let the woman make of it what she liked. She gave Irma the receipt at supper, folded once, the way you pass a note in school. She did not make a speech. She said the terms, which were the only speech she knew how to make. The money was not a gift and not a loan. It was an investment, of the kind her teacher at the business school had once made in her, and the interest on it was that Irma would someday do the same for a girl with a head for figures and no $40, when such a girl crossed her path. That was the whole contract. It was, Ruth said, how the account had always been kept in this country, by the women who remembered who had held the door. Stella got up from the table and went to the stove and stood there a while with her back to them, and Irma held the receipt in both hands and looked at Ruth with the old, grave 10-year-old's face she had worn in the front hall on the first day. And then she smiled, and it was like a lamp being turned up. She kept the receipt all her life. But that is ahead of the story. There was one more thing from those years that belongs in the book, and Ruth herself would have left it out, which is exactly why it must go in. Eddie Tillman took to walking her to the corner on Saturday noons, after the half-day, when the office closed and the warehouse went quiet. It began without anyone deciding it. Two people who had spent the week among figures, not quite ready to stop speaking in them, talking of the freight rates in the county and the way the valley was changing. 11 o'clock to the corner of Canal and Main, and then, "Good day, Mrs. Halloway," and his hat tipped and the ruined hip carrying him off toward his rooming house. He never pressed and never presumed. He had been married once, long ago, to a girl who died of the influenza in 1918, and he had kept her photograph on his dresser and his own counsel ever since. And there was in his company the deep restfulness of a man who wanted nothing from you but the truth of the day's work. Lena Marsh got hold of it, of course, and made it a project, the way she made everything a project. "There was a man," she announced to the kitchen table over her cookies, "a real man, with a trade and a savings account and a hat he tipped like he meant it, walking her friend to the corner every Saturday of the world. And what did Ruth intend to do about it?" And Ruth, who had turned the question over more than she would ever have admitted aloud, gave Lena the answer she had arrived at, which was the true one. She said she had been married for 22 years to a man who had lived in her house and worn her work like a coat, and that she had nothing against marriage. She spoke well of it,
the way she spoke well of any institution whose books she had not personally audited.
But she had a house that was hers, and work that was hers, and a name on a door in glass letters, and a friendship with a good man that asked nothing and gave a great deal. And she had learned, late but thoroughly, that a woman could want company without wanting a household, and conversation without signing anything. The corner of Canal and Main was enough. If that was spinsterish, then the word needed new arithmetic. Lena said she would have it embroidered on a sampler. Ruth said she would prefer it in the ledger. And, in fact, that night, on the page of things that do not appear on a balance sheet, she wrote, E.T. walked me to the corner, Saturdays. Some accounts are kept open not because anything is owed, but because neither party wants to close them.
And then, because the girl in Holyoke was not the only one who was owed an honest example, she left the page where Irma would find it someday, years later, going through the books of a woman who had taught her that every entry in a life, even the tender ones, should be true. Ned came back to Hadley Falls once, in November of 1939. She heard the bell on a Sunday afternoon, in the blue hour when the lamps were just lit, and she knew the figure on the porch before she reached the door, the way she had once known his footstep on the stair. He was 56 years old and looked 70. The pigskin suitcase had been new 8 years ago. The one he stood with now was cardboard, held with a strap. He had the collar still, and he smoothed it still, and the sight of that old gesture on that worn man did something to her she had not expected. It closed the last account. Standing there in her own doorway, with the warm house at her back, she discovered that she was not angry anymore, and had not been for some time, and that what remained was not forgiveness either, but something quieter and more final, the way you feel about a customer whose debt was written off so long ago that the page has yellowed. He said he had been in Albany, and before that in Hartford again, and that times were very hard, harder than people said. He said he had heard she had done well, that people spoke of her, and that he had always known she had it in her. He said it the way a man says things that cost him nothing, to see what they might buy. He did not quite ask for money. The ask sat in the air between them anyway, like smoke. Ruth did not invite him in. The house on Chestnut Street was paid for, every shingle and every tax bill, out of the columns in the green ledger, and there were boundaries she kept the way she kept her books, exactly, and without apology. But she was not cruel, and it was November, and the man had once been 26, with a laugh that could light the whole dining room. She went to the kitchen and came back with $5 folded small, and she put it in his hand and told him it was a gift and not a loan, and that it was the last, and that the trains for Springfield left at 6:40, and he would want the warm waiting room, not her porch. He looked at the $5 and then at her, and something came into his face that she had never seen there in 22 years of marriage. He looked at her the way Eddie Tillman looked at her, the way Foss did, the way the town had finally learned to. He looked at her as herself. He said, at the bottom of the porch steps, with his back already half-turned, and the words dragged out of him like freight, that the books, Ruth. That she should know he had always known about the books. That it was the one thing he had never been able to say. She stood in her doorway, with the cold air coming in around her, and the lamplight going out, and she gave him the only answer the moment deserved, which was the plain truth, level as a ruled line. That she had always known, too. Then she wished him a safe journey and closed the door, and went back to the kitchen where Stella was making gravy, and Irma was home from her business course in Holyoke for the weekend, arguing happily with the radio about the news from Europe. The war that was still, in that November of 1939, a thing happening to other people's sons, spoken of in Hadley Falls the way you speak of weather on another coast. She did not enter the $5 in the ledger. Some entries you do not post. But that night, on the page of dates, she wrote, November 12th, 1939. N came to the door, gave him $5 and the truth. The truth was the better gift.
Then she turned the page, because the book was nearly full now. 30 years of her life in her own hand, from the gingham and kerosene of 1908, through the wages in the coal and the taxes and the payrolls. All of it hers, every line signed by the doing of it. And she began, on the first clean leaf, a new section, headed only 1940. It was a good year, and then a better one. The valley stirred like a field after rain. The rag company took a second mill building, and a machine parts shop from Worcester leased the old weaving shed. And on Saturdays, Main Street was crowded enough that a body had to say, "Excuse me," at the feed store door. Bartlett and Foss shipped more in the spring of 1941 than in any spring since 1929. And Foss, 70 years old now, and finally, grudgingly willing to sit by his own fire on raw mornings, had the glass lettering on the office door changed. It had said Amos Foss. It said now, Amos Foss, R.C. Halloway, office manager. He complained about the cost of the lettering for a month. He had paid for it without being asked, and they both knew it, and it was never once mentioned between them, which is to say, it was understood perfectly. In June of 1941, Irma Kowalski finished the 2-year business course in Holyoke at the top of her class, bookkeeping, the Burroughs machine, and a typing speed that made the examiners check their watches. She was 19, tall now, the braids long since pinned up, the grave 10-year-old grown into a young woman who still checked every step, but against her own judgment now, instead of anyone's face. There was a position waiting for her in Springfield, junior bookkeeper at a hardware house, real wages and a future with a door on it. The night before she left, Ruth gave her a present at the kitchen table in front of Stella, who cried quietly into her apron and pretended it was the onions. It was a ledger, new, green leather, the nearest thing the stationery shop on Main Street could find to a book made 33 years before, and on the spine, pressed in gold, 2 letters, I.K. Ruth had had it in her drawer for a month, waiting. She told the girl what the business school had never put in any lesson. She told her that the world would offer her 100 chances to let her work wear another name, a husband's, a foreman's, a firm's, a man's who smoothed his collar, and that each time it would be called practical, or loyal, or the way things stood. She told her that a column balanced was a kind of promise, and that the only promises worth keeping were the ones where your own hand signed the page. And she told her, this last quietly, holding the girl's eyes, that she was never, as long as she lived, to let that book sit in somebody else's drawer. Irma held the ledger against her chest, the way she had once held her school satchel on the front hall, and she was no longer too young to understand, and they both knew it, and neither of them said so, because some truths are posted, and some are carried forward, and this one had been carried forward for 33 years, and was now, finally, entered in a new book. That night, after the house had gone quiet, Stella's radio off, the girl's valise packed and standing in the hall like a promise of its own, Ruth sat at the kitchen table one last time, with the pear tree black against the summer dark outside the window. She opened the old green ledger, her ledger, the RC worn to a whisper on the spine, past the young girl's gingham, past the wages and the coal, past the page of dates, the letters answered and unanswered, the night of the inventory, the door in November. She came to the last section, the one headed 1940, and found, at the foot of its final page, that she had room for one more line. She thought of the woman on the bench in the front hall,
10 years ago this October, listening to a coffee pot fill an empty house. She thought of what she would tell her, if the years allowed such letters. That the suitcase would stop mattering. That the fear would turn out to be a door. That the word later was the only thief in the house. And it had never once been Ned. It had been the word itself. And she had evicted it, and it would never be let back in.
She dipped her pen, and in her small, exact hand, the hand that had kept the finest books in the county for 30 years under every name but her own, and now signed its own, she wrote the last line of the account. June 28th, 1941. This book is nearly full. Am buying a larger one tomorrow. Balance carried forward, and owing, as always, to no one. She closed the cover. The lamp burned steady. There was a small thing left to record, though it belonged to no column. Down the hall, in the back bedroom that had once been meant for a nursery and had become a counting room and then a student's room, Stella was humming over her mending, an old song from a country Ruth had never seen, and the sound came through the house the way warmth comes from a stove, without being asked, and without asking anything. On the desk at Bartlett and Foss, in a glass-lettered door, her name waited for Monday.
On the pantry shelf, the cocoa tin held what it held, against a rainy day that no longer frightened her. And in the top drawer of her own desk, bought with her wages, in her house, in the 33rd year of the ledger, the snapshot from the porch steps lay where she could find it. A woman alone in the sun, taken by a man who had not understood, even then, that the picture was the whole story. She had been standing on her own 2 feet the entire time. It had only taken the world a while to develop the plate. Somewhere down the valley a night freight called once and was gone. And Ruth Halloway turned out the light on a house that was warm and paid for, and hers, and went up to bed in the dark like a woman whose books, at long last, footed true.